On the day my daughter got married, I pretended to have lost everything to find out who really loved me. Richard Harrison trembled as he held the microphone in the hall filled with elegantly dressed guests. His only daughter, Jennifer, watched him from the altar in her white lace wedding dress that cost over $50,000, unaware of what she was about to hear. It was then that he took a deep breath and announced with a choked voice that he had lost absolutely everything in a failed investment the previous week. "Dear friends and family," Richard began, interrupting the ceremony that was about to start, "I need to be honest with you at this important moment. I've lost everything. My company, my savings, this house you've known for so many years." The silence that followed was piercing. Jennifer froze at the altar, still clutching her bouquet of white roses. Her brown eyes filled with tears as she processed her father's words. The groom, Michael Anderson, a young lawyer from a traditional New York City family, immediately stepped closer to her with an expression Richard had never seen before. "Sweetheart, maybe we should cancel our honeymoon to Paris," Michael whispered, loud enough for some guests to hear. "We need to be practical now." Those words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. In 30 years of building his real estate empire, he had learned to read people. And at that moment, he saw something in his son-in-law that sent a chill down his spine. Mrs. Patricia, Michael's mother, who had always been so affectionate and called Richard old friend, discreetly began making her way to the exit. She only greeted a few people near the door and disappeared without saying goodbye to the bride's family. Richard watched her every move, every furtive glance she cast at the other guests. Richard's best man, Anthony Miller, his closest friend for over 20 years and business partner in several ventures, simply shook his head in disapproval and walked toward the exit. He didn't even look at his friend, who was falling apart on stage. "Dad, no matter what happened," Jennifer said, running to him and hugging him tightly, "you're still my father, and I love you just the same." The tears in her eyes were genuine, and Richard felt his heart break. Part of him wanted to stop right there to reveal it was all a test, but something in his son-in-law's reaction made him continue with the plan he had devised for weeks. 2 weeks before the wedding, Richard had overheard a phone conversation between Michael and an estate lawyer. The young man was asking about ways to access his father-in-law's assets after the marriage, specifically mentioning the partial asset regime they had chosen. The suspicion that arose then turned into a desperate need to protect his daughter. Guests began to disperse. Distant uncles who had come from Pennsylvania for the wedding vanished like smoke, even cancelling the breakfast scheduled for the next day at Richard's house. Cousins he hadn't seen in years, who had arrived excitedly the week before with expensive gifts, now avoided eye contact. The wedding planner, Sarah Williams, who had known the family for 5 years, immediately appeared demanding payment for the vendors. "Richard, I need you to settle these outstanding bills today," she said, showing no compassion for his situation. "The vendors won't stop calling." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now continuing. In the weeks that followed, Richard kept playing his role as a bankrupt businessman. He sold his luxury car and started driving an old, simple sedan. He cancelled his daughter's credit cards, forcing her to ask for money for every purchase. Michael Anderson, who had once been affectionate and attentive, began showing a side Jennifer had never seen before. He questioned every penny spent in the house, controlled the grocery shopping, and even suggested she look for a job. "Jen, you need to understand our new reality," he said one morning, as they had coffee in the kitchen of the apartment they'd received as a wedding gift from Richard. "We can't keep living like we have endless money." "But Michael, it's just $300 for groceries," Jennifer replied, confused by her husband's drastic change in behavior. "300 today, 500 tomorrow. That's how families go broke," he shot back with a coldness that sent chills down her spine. Richard watched from a distance, heartbroken as his daughter slowly uncovered her husband's true nature. Every phone call from her, crying about some humiliation Michael had put her through, felt like a stab to his heart. The situation grew even tenser when Michael suggested they sell the apartment they'd received as a gift. "It's too big for just the two of us, and with the money from the sale, we could buy something smaller and still have funds left to invest," he argued over dinner one evening. But Michael, this apartment was my father's wedding gift to us. It has sentimental value, Jennifer protested. Sentimental value doesn't pay the bills, Jen. You need to grow up and understand we're a family now. We have to think practically. That same week, Jennifer realized she'd have to find a job. At 28, the only daughter of a successful businessman, she had never worked a formal job before. Though she had a degree in psychology, her lack of experience led to humiliating interviews. During one particularly difficult interview at a small clinic in the Upper East Side of New York City, where the interviewer practically mocked her for her inexperience, Jennifer called her father, sobbing uncontrollably. "Dad, I can't do this," she cried into the phone. "The man said I'm just a spoiled rich girl who's never worked a day in her life." Richard's throat tightened at the sound of his daughter's pain. In the background, he could hear Michael complaining that she was being dramatic. "Jennifer, stop crying and go after another job," Michael shouted, loud enough for Richard to hear. "You can't give up at the first sign of trouble." Michael's lack of empathy for Jennifer's suffering infuriated Richard, but he had to see this test through to the end, even if it meant watching his daughter endure hardship. Meanwhile, people Richard never expected began showing their true colors. Mrs. Rosa, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 20 years, appeared one morning at the door of the modest home Richard had rented in Queens. "Mr. Richard, I brought my savings," she said, holding out an envelope of crumpled bills. "It's $15,000 I've saved all these years. You've always been good to me and my family." Richard was moved by the gesture of the 60-year-old woman who saw him as a father figure. She had worked in his home since she was 40, watched Jennifer grow up, and was more than an employee. She was family. "Mrs. Rosa, I can't take your savings," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course you can, Mr. Richard. This is what family does. We help each other in hard times. Besides, you paid for my son Andrew's education, remember? Now it's my turn to give back." Mrs. Rosa's loyalty stood in stark contrast to the behavior of those Richard had once considered close. Anthony Miller, his former best friend and best man at his wedding, had not only disappeared, but was also spreading around town that he had always known Richard was irresponsible with money. 3 former employees from Richard's construction company showed up at his house on a Thursday night. Mark, the head engineer, John, the foreman, and Sandra, the architect, all with over 10 years at the company. "Boss, we want to propose something," said Mark nervously. "The 3 of us want to work for free until you can get the company back on its feet." "That's crazy. You all have families to support," Richard protested. "Exactly why we're doing it," Sandra replied. "You gave us opportunities when no one else would. You paid for courses, treated us like family. Now it's our turn to help." The loyalty of those employees moved Richard deeply. They didn't know everything was a test, but they were willing to sacrifice their own salaries to help someone they considered a father figure. Meanwhile, Jennifer's situation with Michael Anderson was deteriorating rapidly. The young lawyer, who had once been attentive and romantic, was now controlling and petty. He went as far as hiding her credit card and giving her a weekly allowance of $200. "Michael, I need to buy hygiene products, and you only gave me $50 for it," Jennifer complained one morning. "Then buy the cheaper ones. You need to learn to budget, Jen. We're not rich anymore." His coldness was destroying Jennifer from the inside. The young woman who had always been treated like a princess now felt humiliated in her own marriage. Richard's distant cousin Karen, who hadn't spoken to him in over 5 years due to an inheritance dispute, suddenly appeared offering help. But her questions were always about what remained of the family's assets. "Richard, were you able to save anything? Any properties, overseas investments?" she asked during a visit she insisted on making. "No, Karen, I lost everything," Richard lied, watching her reaction. "What a shame, cousin. But don't worry, these things happen," she said, though Richard noticed the relief in her eyes upon learning he was truly broke. The most painful moment of the test came when Michael suggested something that made Richard want to stop everything immediately. "Jen, I think we need to talk about your father," Michael said one evening over dinner at their apartment. "What about my dad?" Jennifer asked, suspicious. "Well, he's getting old, has no income, and frankly, we can't afford to support him here. What are you saying, Michael? There are very good public nursing homes, places where he can get proper care without being a burden on our family. Jennifer was stunned. The suggestion of putting her father, who was only 55 and perfectly healthy, in a nursing home felt like a slap in the face. Are you insane? My father is not going to any nursing home. Jen, be rational. We're just starting our lives. We might have kids soon. We can't carry that weight. The word weight referring to her father was the last straw for Jennifer. She burst into tears and ran out of the apartment. Richard received a desperate call from his daughter at 2 in the morning. "Dad, can I stay at your place tonight?" she asked, sobbing. "Of course, sweetheart. What happened?" "Michael said you're a burden on our family and that you should go to a nursing home." Richard felt anger rise in his throat. The test was revealing people's true colors, including his own son-in-law's, but seeing his daughter suffer like this was becoming unbearable. The next morning, Michael showed up at Richard's house demanding Jennifer come home. "She's my wife and should be by my side," he said arrogantly. "She stays here until she feels better," replied Richard, observing the young man his daughter had chosen to marry. "Look, Richard, I'll be blunt. I married your daughter because she came from a financially stable family. Now that you've lost everything, our situation has completely changed." Michael Anderson's brutal confession hit Richard like a punch to the gut. The young man had just admitted he married Jennifer for financial gain. "Are you telling me you married my daughter for money?" Richard asked, trying to stay calm. "Not exactly for money, but financial stability was a big factor. Jennifer is a good girl, but let's be honest, she was raised like a princess and doesn't know how to do anything. Without her family's financial support, our marriage has no future." Richard had to restrain himself from lunging at the young man. The coldness with which Michael spoke about his daughter, as if she were a failed investment, made it clear this test was revealing painful but necessary truths. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. That same week, Mrs. Patricia, Michael's mother, reappeared in their lives, but not to offer support. She showed up at the couple's apartment with a list of wedding gifts she had given them. "Jennifer, darling, I need you to return the silverware and crystal set I gave you as gifts," she said without a hint of shame. "But Mrs. Patricia, those were wedding gifts," Jennifer replied, confused. "Yes, but circumstances have changed, haven't they? These items have been in our family for generations, and now that you're struggling, I think it's best they come back to me." The humiliation Jennifer felt in that moment was crushing. The woman who had treated her like a daughter now saw her as someone unworthy of the gifts she'd received. Richard learned what happened through a tearful call from his daughter. Every one of her sobs felt like a stab to his heart, but he knew she needed to see the truth about the people around her. The test kept revealing surprises. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Betty, a 70-year-old woman they barely knew, who lived next to Richard's old apartment, started leaving meals at his new doorstep. "Mr. Harrison, I made a little extra food and brought some for you," she said timidly when he met her at the door. "Mrs. Betty, you don't have to do this," Richard replied, touched by her kindness. "Of course I do. It's in hard times that we find out who our real neighbors are. Besides, cooking for one is sad. I'd rather cook for two." Mrs. Betty's simplicity and generosity stood in stark contrast to the greed of those Richard had once considered close. A retired widow, living on just a small pension, was sharing her food with someone she believed was in need. Michael's behavior grew even more unbearable. He started coming home late, always with flimsy excuses about working overtime. Jennifer, already fragile from their financial struggles and constant humiliation, began to suspect something else was going on. The confirmation came cruelly. Karen, the distant cousin who had suddenly reappeared, called Jennifer with devastating news. "Jen, sweetheart, I don't know if I should tell you this, but I saw your husband leaving a restaurant with a blonde," she said, feigning concern. "What do you mean, Aunt Karen?" "They looked very close, dear, and she was carrying an expensive designer purse. Kind of strange for someone who's supposedly struggling financially, don't you think?" The revelation shattered Jennifer. She confronted Michael Anderson that same night, and he didn't even deny it. Jen, you need to understand that our situation has changed everything, he said coldly. When I married you, it was one thing. Now it's completely different. Are you cheating on me? She asked, her voice trembling. I won't lie to you. I've met someone who understands my current situation better. The confession of betrayal was the final blow for Jennifer. She left the house that night and went straight to her father's place, emotionally shattered. Richard Harrison welcomed her with open arms, but inside he was boiling with rage. Seeing his daughter betrayed and humiliated by someone he had treated like a son was testing all his limits. The next morning, Anthony Miller, his former best friend, showed up at Richard's house. But it wasn't a visit for reconciliation. Richard, I've brought a buyer for your mansion, he said bluntly. A client of mine is interested in the property. Anthony, the house isn't for sale yet, Richard replied, staring at the man he had considered a brother for decades. But you'll have to sell, won't you? Better do it now while the market's good. In fact, I can take the commission from the sale to cover some losses from investments we made together. Anthony's shameless greed left Richard speechless. 30 years of friendship had turned into a business opportunity for the man he once called his best friend. The lowest point of the test came when Michael appeared at Richard's house with a proposal that made the businessman lose his composure entirely. Richard, I'll be straight with you, the young man said, sitting in the modest living room of the rented house. I know you must still have some savings hidden somewhere. I have nothing, Michael. I lost everything. Look, I'll make you an offer. If you give me a reasonable amount, say $200,000, I'll walk out of Jennifer's life peacefully. You'll have peace, and I'll start over. Richard was stunned. His son-in-law was emotionally blackmailing him, demanding money to divorce his daughter. You're asking me for money to divorce my daughter? Richard asked, disbelieving. It's not like that. It's compensation for the trouble. After all, I married under one set of circumstances, and the situation changed completely. I think it's fair to get something for the shift in expectations. The cold calculation behind Michael's words made Richard realize the test had gone too far. His daughter was married to a man who saw her as a commodity, someone who would charge to leave her life. The divorce lawyers' meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in the conference room of a law firm in downtown New York City. Jennifer, Michael, Richard, and their respective lawyers sat around a dark mahogany table. Michael had hired a divorce attorney known for contentious cases, someone with a reputation for securing large settlements. The man, Dr. Philip Morgan, opened the meeting with veiled threats. My client has suffered significant emotional damages in this marriage, the lawyer said. The sudden change in the family's financial situation caused psychological distress that deserves compensation. What emotional damages? Asked Jennifer's lawyer, Dr. Paul Hunter. My client married under certain circumstances and had his life completely upended by information the bride's family withheld. Richard watched in silence as Michael tried to paint Jennifer as the villain. The young man had crafted a strategy to leave the marriage not just unscathed, but with a payout. Furthermore, Dr. Philip continued, my client gave up career opportunities to dedicate himself to this marriage. He deserves compensation for that. Jennifer was visibly shaken, listening to her husband talk about her as if she were a fraud. Richard saw his daughter breaking down in tears and couldn't take it anymore. That's when he abruptly stood up from his chair and spoke the words that changed everything. Enough, I never lost anything, it was all a test. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room froze, processing the bombshell Richard had just dropped. Michael Anderson was the first to react, anger flashing in his eyes. What do you mean a test? You're playing with people's lives. Exactly, Richard replied, staring straight at his son-in-law. A test to find out who truly loves my daughter and who's here for the money. Jennifer was in shock, looking at her father with a mix of relief and anger. Dad, you faked all this. You put me through this humiliation for a test? Jennifer, I found out 2 weeks before the wedding that your husband was consulting a lawyer about accessing my assets after the marriage, Richard explained. I had to make sure you weren't marrying someone who only wanted our money. Michael turned red with rage. This is a setup. You tricked me. I'll sue for emotional damages. Go ahead and sue, Richard said calmly. "But I doubt you'll prove emotional damages when you just admitted you married my daughter for financial gain and even demanded $200,000 to divorce her." Michael's lawyer tried to intervene. "My client was provoked into reacting this way by the artificial situation you created." "Your client showed his true colors," Dr. Paul Hunter countered. "No one forced him to cheat, humiliate, or try to blackmail my client." Jennifer stood up from the table, still processing everything. "Dad, I need time to think. You put me through hell to prove a point." "I know, sweetheart, and I know you have every right to be angry with me, but now you've seen who your husband really is. Would you rather have found out now or after years of a miserable marriage?" Tears streamed down Jennifer's face, this time tears of relief mixed with anger. She looked at Michael with disgust. "You betrayed me, humiliated me, tried to have my father committed, and then demanded money to divorce me. Even if it was a test, your reactions were real." Michael made one last desperate attempt. "Jen, you have to understand, I was manipulated. None of what I did reflects who I really am." "Of course it does," she replied, with a firmness Richard hadn't seen in months. "You showed who you are when you thought you had nothing left to gain from me." The meeting ended with Michael and his lawyer storming out, threatening lawsuits that would never materialize. Richard knew the young man had no way to prove manipulation when his own actions condemned him. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, back to the story. In the days following the revelation, Richard had long talks with Jennifer. His daughter was grappling not just with her husband's betrayal, but also her father's deception. "Dad, I get that you wanted to protect me," she said during lunch at the new house Richard had rented, "but you made me suffer in ways I never thought possible." "I know, Jennifer, and I regret every tear you shed because of my test. But look at it this way. In 2 months, you found out your husband married you for money, cheated on you, tried to control you financially, and even charged you to divorce him. Would you rather have discovered that 10 years from now, after having kids with him?" The father's logic made sense, but the pain was still fresh in Jennifer's heart. "But I could have found out another way, Dad. You didn't have to fake bankruptcy." "How, my dear? You were blinded by love. When someone is in love, they don't see the other person's flaws. It took an extreme situation to reveal his true character." During this conversation, Richard also revealed all the details that had made him suspicious of Michael Anderson. The talk about prenuptial agreements, the comments about future inheritance, the change in behavior after the engagement. "Remember when he started coming over more often and always asked about my business?" Richard asked. "I thought he was just trying to get to know the family better," Jennifer replied. "And remember when he suggested I include him in some investments? I figured he wanted to bond with you. Jennifer, all the signs were there, but you couldn't see them because you were in love." The conversation helped Jennifer understand her father's motives better, but she still needed time to fully forgive the manipulation. Richard decided to reward those who had shown loyalty during the test. Mrs. Rosa, the faithful housekeeper who had offered her savings, received a 2-bedroom house in her neighborhood and a generous retirement plan that would allow her to stop working. "Mr. Richard, this is too much," she said, crying as she accepted the keys to her new home. "Mrs. Rosa, you worked in my home for 20 years and helped raise my daughter with me. This house is the least I can do for you." The 3 loyal employees, Mark, John, and Sandra, were given shares in the company. Richard created a new business model where they would be minority partners, ensuring they'd share in future profits. "You were willing to work for free to help me," Richard said, during a meeting at the company's new headquarters. "Now you'll work as owners because that's what you are, part of the family." Mrs. Betty, the kind neighbor who had left meals at their door, received a surprise that moved her deeply. Richard discovered she was struggling to pay her apartment fees and took over all her expenses for the rest of her life. "Mrs. Betty, you shared your food with me when you thought I was in need. Now let me take care of your bills," he said, handing her the payment receipts. "Mr. Richard, I didn't do that expecting anything in return," she replied, tears in her eyes. "I know, Mrs. Betty. That's exactly why you deserve all the good things." Meanwhile, Richard also had to deal with those who had failed the test. Anthony Miller, his former best friend, tried to reconnect when he learned it had all been a ruse. "Richard, you have to understand. I was scared," he said during a meeting he had requested. "I didn't want to get tangled in financial trouble." "Anthony, you were my best friend for 30 years, Richard replied. "And at the first sign of difficulty, you abandoned me and even tried to profit from my supposed downfall." "But it wasn't real, Richard. If I'd known it was a test..." "Exactly, Anthony. If it had been real, you would have left me hanging when I needed you most. That tells me everything about our friendship." Richard chose not to hold a grudge, but also not to rekindle the friendship. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. His cousin Karen also tried to reconnect, making excuses about being confused by the situation. But Richard remembered perfectly the relief in her eyes when she thought he was truly broke. "Karen, you only came back into my life to see what was left of my assets," he said during a phone call. "That proves our relationship was always based on interest." The event planner, Sarah, tried to reclaim Richard's contract for future events, but he politely declined. The coldness she showed during the supposed crisis revealed she saw the family only as a source of income. Jennifer's divorce process was quick and uncomplicated. Michael Anderson, knowing he had been exposed, didn't try to contest it or ask for any compensation. His only concern was preventing the story from spreading in his social circles. Over the following months, Jennifer focused on rebuilding herself emotionally. She decided to take a business management course to better understand her father's ventures and eventually work with him. "Dad, I want to work at the company," she said one morning during breakfast. "Jennifer, you don't have to work. You know you can have any life you want." "But I want to work, Dad. I want to feel useful, productive. What I went through taught me that relying only on others is dangerous." Richard felt proud of the maturity his daughter had developed after the whole ordeal. The suffering, as painful as it had been, had made her a stronger, more independent person. It was during the management course that Jennifer met Daniel Rivers, a 30-year-old entrepreneur launching a social tech startup. He knew nothing about her past or her family's wealth. "What does Jennifer do for work?" Daniel asked a classmate. "She said she's helping her father restructure the family business," the friend replied. Daniel was drawn to Jennifer, not for her financial situation, but for the intelligence and determination she showed in class. They started dating without him knowing she was the daughter of a millionaire businessman. Richard observed his daughter's relationship from a distance, but this time with peace of mind. Daniel treated Jennifer with genuine respect and affection. When he finally learned about the family's wealth months later, his reaction was surprise, not greed. "Jennifer, why didn't you tell me about your family?" he asked during dinner. "I wanted to be sure you were interested in me, not my financial situation," she answered honestly. "That explains why you always insisted on splitting the bill," Daniel laughed. "I even thought you were teaching me a lesson in female independence." The natural way Daniel reacted reassured both Jennifer and Richard. The young man continued treating his girlfriend exactly the same, with no change in behavior or expectations. A year after the test was revealed, Richard organized a small gathering at the family mansion, which he had bought back. But this time only the people who truly mattered were there. Mrs. Rosa came with her son Andrew, whom Richard had helped graduate with an engineering degree. Mrs. Betty brought a homemade cake, as she always did. Mark, John and Sandra arrived with their families, now partners in the company, which was thriving more than ever. Jennifer came with Daniel, who was already part of the family. She was 3 months pregnant, glowing with happiness over her new love and the new life growing inside her. "Dad, I want to make a toast," Jennifer said, raising her glass of orange juice. "Go ahead, sweetheart." "A year ago, I thought you were the cruelest father in the world," she said, tears in her eyes. "Today, I understand you're the most protective father a daughter could have." Richard was moved by his daughter's words. Seeing her happy, fulfilled, and with someone who truly loved her made all the pain of the test worthwhile. "Jennifer, I know I made you suffer and I regret how I handled everything," he said. "But I don't regret protecting you from an unhappy life with someone who didn't love you." Daniel, who already knew the whole story, hugged his girlfriend tenderly. "Your father did what any father would do to protect his daughter," he said. "And I'm grateful for that because it was that experience that made you the strong, independent woman I met." The conversation continued late into the night, with everyone sharing stories and plans for the future. Richard looked around the table and saw only sincere faces, people who were there out of love and loyalty, not self-interest. Months later, Richard and Jennifer created a social project together to help women in vulnerable situations within abusive relationships. The experience Jennifer went through, even though it was a test, made her understand what many women endure when they discover their relationships are based on self-interest. "Dad, I want our experience to help other women," she said during a project planning meeting. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Many women live in relationships where they're exploited financially or emotionally, but can't leave because they depend on their husbands. We can create a program to give them financial and emotional independence." The project was named New Beginnings and operated in the family's former mansion, which was transformed into a support center. Women in difficult situations received professional training, psychological support, and help rebuilding their lives. The first beneficiary was a 40-year-old woman named Betty, who had been in an abusive marriage for 15 years. Her husband controlled all the household money and forbade her from working. "I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how," she told Jennifer during a therapy session. "He always said I wouldn't survive on my own." "I understand completely," Jennifer replied. "I went through something similar, even if only briefly. Financial dependence makes us vulnerable to all kinds of abuse." The project grew and became a reference in the city. Richard watched with pride as the test he had conducted, however controversial, turned into a way to help others. Daniel married Jennifer in a simple ceremony, attended only by close family and friends. This time there were no tests or surprises, just genuine love being celebrated. The couple's first child, a boy named Richard in honor of his grandfather, was born surrounded by love and protection. Grandfather Richard, now 56, melted at the sight of his grandson and promised himself he would be a present and affectionate grandfather. "Jennifer, can I ask you something?" Daniel said one night as they rocked the baby. "Of course, my love." "Do you still feel angry at your father for what he did?" Jennifer thought for a moment before answering. "No, Daniel. Now I understand he did it out of love. It was painful, but it saved me from years of unhappiness. If he hadn't done the test, I might be trapped in a terrible marriage, maybe with children, too afraid to leave. And would you do the same for our son if you had to?" "I hope I never have to," Jennifer laughed. "But if it's to protect him from an unhappy life, I'd do anything." Richard, who had overheard the conversation from the living room, smiled at his daughter's words. She had understood that true love sometimes requires difficult, painful decisions. 2 years after the test, Richard reflected on everything that had happened. He had lost a self-serving son-in-law, a false best friend, and some opportunistic relatives. In return, he had gained employees who became family, discovered kind neighbors who turned into dear friends, and watched his daughter grow into a strong, independent woman. The company thrived under its new partnership structure. The employees, now partners, worked with renewed dedication. Mrs. Rosa lovingly cared for her new home and visited the family regularly, considered the grandmother of little Richard. Mrs. Betty became the most beloved neighbor, always present for the family's important moments. Her apartment turned into a gathering spot for afternoon coffees and heartfelt conversations about life. The Fresh Start project had already helped over 50 women rebuild their lives. Jennifer found fulfillment watching other women discover their strength and independence. Daniel expanded his startup and became a successful entrepreneur, always supported and encouraged by his wife and father-in-law. He never showed interest in joining Jennifer's family business, preferring to carve his own path. On a Sunday afternoon, 3 years after the test, the entire family gathered at the mansion for a special lunch. Little Richard toddled around the garden, chased by his grandfather's adoring gaze. "Dad," Jennifer said, watching her husband play with their son. "Thank you." "For what, my dear?" "For protecting me even when I didn't understand, for risking our relationship to save me from an unhappy life, for teaching me that true love sometimes hurts, but always shields." Richard hugged his daughter, moved. All the pain and suffering from the test had been worth it to see Jennifer happy and fulfilled. "Jennifer, "You're the most important thing in my life," he said. "I'd do it all over again 1,000 times if it meant keeping you safe." "I know, Dad. And now I understand that's what you did. You protected me." The afternoon sun bathed the garden where 3 generations of the family played together. Richard looked at his son, daughter-in-law, and grandson, knowing he'd made the right choice. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what truly matters, and sometimes you must cause pain to prevent far greater suffering. The end. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. Do you believe Richard did the right thing by testing everyone around him? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.